She always believed that their love was strong and their marriage honest. But after Peter Mitchell's death, Grace discovered a truth he never spoke of, a past buried in war, a letter that changed everything, and a search for answers that could rewrite the story they thought they knew. Before we dive into the story, let me know where you're tuning in from today. Grace had always prided herself on being an organized person, yet in the days and weeks following Peter's death, she found it impossible to keep her mind from drifting. She moved through each hour in a strange fog, planning the funeral, receiving relatives, and responding to endless condolences from neighbors and colleagues. The house felt hollow, despite the warmth of flowers and sympathy cards. In the evenings, she would curl up in Peter's reading chair, a plush armchair by the window, and stare at his old military history books on the shelves. Peter used to claim he was merely a war buff, someone who enjoyed reading about 20th century conflicts, but never once had he spoken in detail about his own background. Whenever she asked, he would smile that faint, gentle smile and say, "It's a long story." She never pushed too hard, content to trust him. Shortly after the funeral, she began the process of settling his estate. She expected routine tasks, contacting banks, verifying life insurance, dealing with the mortgage. Instead, she ran into puzzling anomalies. His birth certificate was nowhere to be found, and there was no trace of a record from the county office where he'd supposedly been born. Social Security documents showed only activity from January 1973 onward, nothing prior. She called the offices for guidance and was told to check older archives or family records. But she had known his parents, or at least the couple he presented as parents, both of whom had passed away years before. Their personal files contained not a single mention of Peter's birth or adoption. Grace told herself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Perhaps Peter had been adopted under unofficial circumstances. Or maybe, in the chaotic swirl of transferring documents from place to place, something had gotten lost. Still, she couldn't quiet the uneasy feeling in her stomach. She had been married to him for 37 years, believing he hailed from a small town in New Hampshire. Yet she found no evidence of him anywhere before 1973, when he claimed to have moved to New York to start fresh after a short stint in the army. Even that tidbit was suspect, since she found no official military records tied to his name. It was as if, prior to 1973, he simply did not exist. She spent entire afternoons rummaging through boxes in the attic, looking for any sign of Peter's earlier life. She discovered their old wedding album, dog-eared vacation photos, a stack of Christmas cards they had sent and received over the years, but nothing about his childhood or teenage years. She recalled that every time she asked about his youth, he would answer vaguely that he had grown up in a rough environment, or that his parents weren't the sentimental type who kept baby pictures. The more she looked, the more uneasy she became. One evening, she found an old suitcase in the attic that she recognized as Peter's from decades ago, a battered relic of brown leather with scuffed corners. She had never opened it before. It simply existed among other relics of their early married life. Inside, she expected to find old clothes or random souvenirs. Instead, what she found changed everything. Wedged against the inner lining, behind what looked like a reinforced panel, was a hidden compartment. Her heart pounded as she carefully pried it open with a small screwdriver. The first thing she saw was a worn Hungarian passport, dated 1967. The photograph showed a much younger version of Peter, thinner face, darker hair, but unmistakably him. The name printed beneath the photo was Thomas Varga. She stared at the passport for a long time, her hand shaking. Beneath it lay a faded photograph of Peter with a woman and a small child, both of whom she had never seen before. Finally, there was a letter, its text written in Hungarian, a language she didn't understand. Her breath caught. She realized with a jolt that her husband, who had always claimed an American upbringing, might have been Hungarian or had some Hungarian identity. Shock, disbelief, and a deep sense of betrayal crashed over her. She felt numb, tears burning at the edges of her eyes. She spent hours in that attic, sifting through the suitcase and staring at the passport. Who was Thomas Varga? Was Peter leading a double life? Why had he hidden these documents so carefully for all these years? For a moment, she felt anger. Had he been a criminal on the run? Had their entire marriage been based on lies? Guilt followed swiftly because she had loved him and believed in him. Hadn't he shown her kindness every single day of their life together? She tried to recall any slip of accent, any reference to Hungary, but nothing came to mind. They had never traveled to Eastern Europe. He had claimed no relatives overseas. With trembling hands, she gathered the passport, the photo, and the letter and carried them downstairs. She spent a sleepless night on the couch, heart racing, trying to imagine explanations that wouldn't break her faith in him. Over the next few days, she attempted to translate the Hungarian letter using online tools, but the text was too long and the handwriting too difficult for the software to recognize. She contacted a local library to see if they had resources for Hungarian translation. The librarian directed her to a small Hungarian cultural center in Manhattan, suggesting she might find someone there who could read the letter for her. She hesitated, worried about privacy, but her need to know the truth outweighed her caution. In the meantime, she combed through the rest of Peter's belongings, bank statements, old tax returns, insurance records. All of it dated from 1973 onward, and all of it seemed legitimate under the name Peter Mitchell. There was simply no trace of any existence prior to that time, at least not under the name he had used during their marriage. She wondered if he had left everything behind to start over. The question was why. The library led her to a certain Mrs. Kovacs at the Hungarian Center, an elderly woman who volunteered there. Over the phone, Grace explained that she had a letter she needed translated, though it was private and possibly very personal. Mrs. Kovacs, sympathetic and curious, offered to help if Grace would bring the letter in person. That Saturday, Grace took the train into the city, clinging to her purse where the letter was tucked safely in a large envelope. She arrived at the Hungarian Center, a modest building on a quiet side street. Posters in the foyer advertised cultural events, folk dance festivals, language classes, concerts featuring traditional music. She felt out of place, a widow from suburbia stepping into a world she never knew existed. Inside the small office, she was greeted by a short woman in her 70s, her hair pulled into a neat bun. She introduced herself as Magda Kovacs and offered Grace a seat. When Grace showed her the letter, Magda put on her reading glasses and carefully studied the handwriting. Almost immediately, her expression turned grave. She began translating aloud in a hushed voice. The letter, addressed to someone named Clara, spoke of mortal danger, fear of both Hungarian and Soviet agents, and a desperate plan to flee. The writer, who signed himself as Thomas, regretted the necessity of leaving his wife and child, but believed it was the only way to keep them alive. He wrote about witnessing an assassination attempt in Vienna, about seeing the actual shooter, a KGB operative, while everyone else suspected a Hungarian defector. He wrote of how the KGB wanted to eliminate him for what he had seen, how Hungarian authorities also saw him as a liability. He spoke of forging new papers and adopting another identity. He apologized for the heartbreak it would cause and vowed he would never forget Clara or their child. Grace sat stunned as Magda reached the end. Her heart hammered in her chest. This letter confirmed that Peter Mitchell was actually Thomas Varga, a Hungarian man who had faked his own disappearance in the 1970s. The date on the letter preceded January 1973 by mere weeks. Grace realized that was the exact time Peter's official record as an American citizen began. She was overwhelmed by conflicting emotions. Relief that perhaps he wasn't a criminal, at least in the usual sense, mingled with shock that he had abandoned an entire family back in Hungary. Anger sparked too for the betrayal. Had he never meant to tell her any of this? Was he truly forced into such a drastic move, or was there more to it? Magda offered to make copies of the letter for Grace, who agreed. As Magda studied the text, she noted that Thomas had mentioned leaving behind a wife, Clara, and a small child, presumably their son. The letter ended with a plea for forgiveness, acknowledging that Thomas might never see them again. Magda gave Grace a sympathetic look. "I've heard stories of Cold War escapes, but this is quite something. If your husband was truly involved in an assassination witness situation, the stakes were very high. People vanished in that era, sometimes permanently." Grace thanked Magda, tucking the letter back into her bag. She felt shaky, as though the foundation of her marriage had cracked. She recalled how Peter had always been so gentle, so consistent. Could that man be the same as the desperate Thomas who had once written this letter? That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She paced the living room, touching the old photograph of her and Peter at various points in their life. Vacations, birthday celebrations, Christmas mornings. She tried to see him anew, to notice if there was any hint of sadness in his eyes that might have betrayed such a past. She felt a stab of empathy, imagining the terror of being hunted by the KGB in the midst of Cold War paranoia. She also felt betrayed. How could he hide something this enormous? She resolved to dig deeper. If Thomas had left behind a wife named Clara, perhaps she was still alive. And their child, a grown man or woman now living in Hungary or somewhere else. Could Grace find them? Would they even want to be found? A part of her wanted to step away, to let the dead remain in peace. But she knew she couldn't. She needed to understand the man she had loved for nearly 4 decades. Over the next weeks, she made discreet inquiries, carefully referencing Thomas Varga to see if anything turned up. Magda connected her with a local Hungarian historian named Dr. Andras Zsigmond, who specialized in Cold War espionage. Grace met him at a coffee shop near the center of Manhattan. He was a thin, bespectacled man in his 50s, with a cautious smile. He listened intently as she explained her situation, occasionally scribbling notes in a small notebook. She handed him a copy of the letter, which he read with quiet concentration. Dr. Zsigmond nodded gravely. In 1972, there was indeed an assassination attempt on a Soviet diplomat stationed in Vienna. The official narrative was that a Hungarian nationalist tried to kill him, but rumors persisted that the real shooter was a Soviet double agent. If your husband witnessed the actual event and could identify the assassin as a KGB operative, he would have been a target for both the Soviets and the Hungarian authorities. It was dangerous to know such a secret. Grace swallowed hard. So it's plausible that he had to vanish completely. Yes, Dr. Zsigmond replied. I've come across a few similar cases, though this is the first time I've encountered someone who successfully made it to the United States and built a new identity for decades. He must have had help or extraordinary luck. Grace thought of Peter's quiet demeanor, how he never bragged or boasted. He had always been content to live in the background, seldom seeking attention. Now she understood that might have been a survival tactic. He left behind a family, she said softly, a wife and a child. I found a photograph of them. Dr. Zsigmond took a sip of his coffee. Finding them, if they're still in Hungary, might be challenging. Records from that era are murky, and many people changed names or moved. But if you're serious, I can put you in touch with researchers in Budapest who might help. Grace hesitated, fear mingling with a deep need to know. I want to find them, or at least learn what happened to them. They deserve to know what became of him. She noticed that Dr. Zsigmond's gaze flickered with concern. You should be aware that poking around old Cold War secrets sometimes stirs up trouble. Not everyone wants these stories uncovered. There could be those who still feel threatened by any revelation of Soviet or Hungarian state involvement. Despite the warnings, Grace felt her resolve harden. She had spent too many nights lying awake, imagining the heartbreak of the abandoned wife and child, and the torment Peter must have endured, living a life under a false name. She couldn't let the story remain unfinished, for her own sake as well as theirs. She called her niece, Anna, who worked part-time for an airline, to see if she could help arrange cheaper flights. Anna, surprised by her aunt's sudden interest in Hungary, asked if this was a vacation plan. Grace offered a partial truth, that she intended to do some genealogical research related to Peter's side of the family. She wasn't ready to share the whole story yet. Anna managed to find Grace a moderately priced ticket to Budapest in early spring. That gave Grace a few weeks to tie up loose ends at home, prepare for her journey, and steel herself for whatever she might find. During those weeks, she tried to carry on normally. She paid bills, visited neighbors, and spent time in the library reading about Hungary's Cold War history. She learned about the oppressive climate under Soviet influence, how individuals suspected of disloyalty were persecuted or worse. The more she read, the more she realized how someone like Thomas might have had no choice but to vanish if he was caught in a lethal crossfire between intelligence agencies. But she also nursed a deep sense of personal grief. She had believed she and Peter had no secrets, but here lay a massive one, overshadowing everything she knew of him. Occasionally, she felt a pang of guilt, wondering if her pursuit of the truth was in some way disloyal to his memory. Yet she also believed that if he had left behind loved ones, they deserved closure. And perhaps she did too. Finally, the day arrived. She packed a suitcase with clothes and a small set of personal items, along with the passport, letter, and photograph. She boarded her flight to Budapest, heart pounding, trying to convince herself that she was doing the right thing. She recalled stepping onto an airplane with Peter beside her so many times before. Vacations, work trips, but now she traveled alone, driven by a mission he had never imagined she would undertake. The flight felt long, each hour heavy with anxious anticipation. She stared out the window at the expanse of the Atlantic, half expecting some last-minute revelation to arrive in her mind, but none did. When the plane finally touched down in Budapest, she felt an odd mix of excitement and dread. She exited the airport into a crisp early spring afternoon. The city had a subdued beauty, with broad avenues lined by old buildings adorned with elegant facades. She checked into a small hotel near the Danube, recommended by Dr. Zygmunt's contacts. The manager greeted her warmly but spoke limited English, so communication was halting. Once she settled in, she found herself standing at the window, gazing at a skyline dotted with spires and domes, the broad river cutting the city in two. She couldn't help but wonder if Peter, or rather Thomas, had known these streets, breathed this air, grown up among these very buildings. The next day, she met with the local historian recommended by Dr. Zygmunt, a stooped man with thinning white hair named Matthias Toth, who ushered her into his cramped office in an old university building. He examined the passport and the letter with keen interest, nodding as Grace recounted what she knew of the story. Then he pulled out a notebook, flipping through pages of scribbled references, police records, and archived tidbits from that era. There was a certain Varga Thomas who disappeared mysteriously in late 1972, he confirmed in a soft, gravelly voice. He was rumored to have knowledge damaging to both the Hungarian and Soviet authorities. The official records state that he died under suspicious circumstances, though no body was ever recovered. Grace felt a chill. So the official story was that he was dead. But he survived. He made it to America and lived under the name Peter Mitchell. That is most fascinating, Toth said, adjusting his glasses. He would not have been alone in wanting to flee, but to do so successfully required contacts, forged documents, and a great deal of luck. If he left a family behind, there might be records of them, but many files were destroyed or lost over time. He offered to check certain archives, marriage records, birth certificates, anything that might point to the identity of Clara and their child. Grace thanked him, feeling a spark of hope. Over the coming days, Toth guided her through a labyrinth of old city registries, battered ledgers, and microfilm reels in dimly lit library halls. They found a marriage record for a Varga Thomas and a woman named Nagi Clara, dated 1965. They also found a birth certificate from 1966 for a male child, Varga Miklos. Grace's heart pounded when she realized she was looking at official proof that Peter, her Peter, had once been married to a woman named Clara, with whom he had a son named Miklos. The more they uncovered, the more real it became. She gazed at the certificate, reading the Hungarian words she only half understood, but her eyes lingered on the date, March 14, 1966. That was the day a child entered the world, fathered by the man who would eventually become her husband in another land, under another name. She felt tears burning at the realization that, all the while, her Peter had carried this invisible history inside him. She asked Toth if they could trace Miklos, the child. Perhaps he was still in Budapest or somewhere in Hungary. Toth seemed uncertain. People moved, changed names, or left the country. But he promised to do his best, suggesting they check public records and university directories. Grace would have done it herself if she spoke Hungarian, but she relied on Toth for language and bureaucratic hurdles. Days became a week, then two as Toth chased leads. Grace wandered the city, letting her grief and curiosity mingle. She visited the grand boulevards of Pest, the historic hills of Buda, the old castle district. She marveled at the architecture, the richness of a culture she had never experienced. At night, in her small hotel room, she held the photograph of Thomas, Clara, and the baby, gazing at the small infant's serious eyes. The photo was faded, but she could see the love in Thomas's expression as he held the child in his arms. She tried to imagine the fear that must have driven him to flee from them. One morning, she found a note slipped under her hotel room door. It was typed in broken English, warning her to stop digging old secrets. Her blood ran cold. She quickly glanced up and down the hallway, but it was empty. Heart pounding, she considered the possibility that someone was following her efforts. She took the note to Toth, who insisted that while most Cold War tensions had eased, there could still be individuals, former agents, criminals, or simply paranoid old men, who disliked outsiders resurrecting these stories. He advised caution, but Grace refused to back down. She had come too far. The tension escalated a few days later when she returned to her hotel room to find the door slightly ajar, the lock forced. She rushed inside, searching through her belongings. Her papers, including the copy of the Hungarian letter and the passport, had been rummaged through but not taken. She felt a wave of relief they were still there, yet dread rose in her chest. The police came and took a report. They insisted it was likely petty theft, but Grace knew better. Someone wanted to scare her off. She considered going home, but the sense of mission prevailed. She owed it to the family left behind, and to the husband she had loved, to see this through. Finally, Toth had a breakthrough. He discovered a reference to a Dr. Varga Miklos, a literature professor who worked at a small university on the outskirts of Budapest. The address was for a tidy suburban neighborhood. Grace's heart hammered. This must be the same Miklos, Thomas's son. She had no idea how to approach him, or if he would even believe her story. Toth offered to accompany her to make introductions, but Grace felt she should go alone at first. She thanked Toth profusely, promising to update him if anything happened. That afternoon, she found herself on a tram heading out of the city center. She clutched the old photograph of the baby and the letter from Thomas to Clara. If this man, Miklos, was indeed Peter's son, how would he react to meeting the widow of the father who had abandoned him decades ago? She rehearsed possible lines in her head, but none of them felt right. All she had was the truth and her own quiet determination. When she arrived at the address, she saw a modest house with a neat garden out front. She hesitated at the gate, gathering her courage. The sky was overcast, a slight wind rattling the branches of a nearby tree. She stepped forward and rang the bell, heart thudding. A moment later, a man in his early 50s opened the door. He had sharp features, dark hair beginning to gray at the temples, and eyes that immediately narrowed with curiosity at the sight of this stranger. He greeted her in Hungarian. She managed a small apology, explaining in English that she spoke no Hungarian. The man switched to accented English. "Can I help you?" She drew a shaky breath. "Are you Miklos Varga?" He confirmed he was. She could see no immediate flicker of recognition, but she pressed on. "My name is Grace Mitchell. I believe you knew my late husband, though you wouldn't know him by that name." He frowned, confusion clouding his eyes. "I don't understand." She held up the old photograph, pointing to the baby in the frame. "This is you, I think, with your father, Thomas Varga. And the woman, your mother, Clara?" A stunned silence. His face paled, and he stepped back, as if reeling. After a long moment, he asked in a hoarse whisper, "Who are you?" She could see the painful question swirling in his gaze. How on earth did this foreign woman have a photo of him as a baby? She explained, voice trembling, that Thomas Varga had fled Hungary in 1972, eventually taking the identity of Peter Mitchell in the United States. She told him she had been married to that man for 37 years. She spoke of her recent discoveries after Peter's death, her attempt to find out what had happened to the family left behind. She apologized for intruding, adding that she had no wish to disturb him but felt compelled to seek the truth. Miklós's eyes flashed with anger, and a deep hurt seemed to surface. "My father vanished when I was just a boy," he said bitterly. "Everyone said he must be dead or a traitor who escaped. I grew up believing he abandoned us. My mother died years ago, never knowing anything for sure." He glared at Grace, as though she were personally responsible. "And you're telling me he was alive all this time, living in America under a new name, while we struggled here?" His voice wavered with raw emotion. Grace's heart ached for him, for the child who had grown up without a father. She tried to explain that Thomas or Peter had acted out of fear for his life, that he had reason to believe he was marked by both Hungarian and Soviet authorities. But Miklós was still reeling, eyes filled with tears he fought to contain. She asked softly if he wanted to see the letter Thomas had written. At first, Miklós refused, stepping back as if the very existence of that letter was poison. Then he relented, trembling slightly. Grace handed him the pages. His eyes flickered over the familiar Hungarian script. A tense silence ensued as he read the words in which Thomas spoke of the guilt, the anguish of leaving Clara and little Miklós behind. Grace saw conflicting emotions raging on his face. Anger, sorrow, perhaps even relief to finally know the truth. Eventually he looked up, tears threatening to spill. Why did he never come back? Why did he never send word that he was alive? Grace could only guess that the risk remained too great, that Peter believed any contact would endanger them all. She recalled how thoroughly he had erased his past. He must have deemed it impossible to reach out without attracting the attention of the very agents he feared. Miklós stepped aside from the door, gesturing for her to come in. His small living room was lined with bookshelves, Hungarian classics, English novels, volumes of literary criticism. A faint smell of coffee lingered. Grace perched on the edge of a worn sofa, still clutching her purse. He sat across from her, hands trembling in his lap, the letter resting on a coffee table between them. Silence pressed in. "Did he have another family?" Miklós asked bitterly. Grace nodded, explaining how she and Peter married in 1976, childless by circumstance, not by choice, and shared a quiet life in upstate New York. Miklós's face hardened as though thinking, so he could build a life there, but not come back for us. Grace tried to gently clarify that Thomas believed returning was impossible, that he was hunted. She showed him the passport, dated 1967, pointed out the stamps, the scribbled notations. She recalled that Peter had once told her, in vague terms, that he had no living relatives. Perhaps he thought it safer for them if no one even suspected they existed. Their conversation stretched on in halting English, each question from Miklós laced with pain. Grace offered whatever answers she could, describing the man she knew, his kindness, his steady presence, his unwavering sense of responsibility in their marriage. The more she spoke, the more confusion she felt. How could the same man have abandoned his child? Yet she sensed that abandoned might be too simplistic a word for the kind of fear he must have lived under. At times, Miklós grew agitated, demanding details. "Did he ever try to contact my mother? Did he mention her name, or mine?" Grace wished she had some comforting revelation but could only shake her head. Peter had never once spoken of a Hungarian family. If there had been letters or phone calls, Grace found no trace of them. It was a painful meeting, fraught with tension, but also a new beginning of sorts. By the time Grace left that afternoon, Miklós had softened enough to thank her for coming, though his eyes still brimmed with tears of loss. She promised to be in touch, to share anything else she discovered. He walked her to the door, silent and pensive. Before she stepped out, he whispered, "My mother never stopped loving him, you know? She always believed he died trying to protect us." Grace felt her own eyes grow wet, and she could offer only a gentle nod before stepping out into the chilly gray light. That night, Grace found an anonymous note slipped under her hotel door again. Another warning, more direct this time. Stop asking questions or face consequences. She shuddered. Clearly, someone was monitoring her. When she told Miklós about it the next day, he became furious on her behalf, though not entirely surprised. Old networks, old grudges, he explained, could persist in the shadows. Some might fear exposure of past misdeeds. It seemed that Thomas's story, long dormant, still had the power to disturb. Despite that threat, Grace pressed on. She and Miklos began meeting occasionally in small cafes or quiet corners of libraries, away from prying eyes. Their initial hostility gradually gave way to cautious curiosity. Miklos asked about Peter's mannerisms, his hobbies, the kind of life he led in the U.S. Grace, in turn, asked about Clara, wanting to piece together the missing years. Miklos described a mother who had been loving but haunted by sorrow, who died of an illness when he was in his 20s. He had grown up with the grandparents for a time, then on his own after they passed. He harbored bitterness, having spent decades believing his father was a deserter or, at best, a victim of some state crackdown. Even now, with this new context, the wounds ran deep. A subtle bond formed as they shared each other's stories. Grace realized that, in a way, Peter's deception had stolen something from them both, but it had also kept them alive and safe. Perhaps Thomas had done the only thing he felt he could. In her quiet moments, Grace imagined the moment when he decided to vanish. She pictured the heartbreak etched on his face as he wrote that last letter to Clara. The more she contemplated his torment, the more she forgave him. His entire adult life was a form of penance. Miklos confessed he wasn't sure he could forgive so easily, but he also found it impossible to walk away from the puzzle now that Grace had opened this door. He marveled that the father he'd believed dead had actually been a teacher's husband in New York, living a quiet suburban life. Felt unreal. Grace gave him small tokens of that life. Photographs of Peter in their yard, smiling softly at the camera. Miklos stared at them, studying the older face of the man who looked so much like himself around the eyes. As spring deepened, Miklos confided that he wanted to visit the place where his father had spent his final decades. A part of him, still angry, wanted to see with his own eyes what had been so worth leaving them behind. Another part hoped it would bring closure. Grace, for her part, felt torn between welcoming him warmly and dreading how painful the trip might be for them both. But she encouraged him nonetheless, offering to host him at her home in New York if he chose to make the journey. He agreed, though they both recognized it would be a complicated experience. Meanwhile, Grace's extended stay in Budapest had begun to attract attention from neighbors at her hotel. She fielded more warnings, subtle glances, even a suspicious man lurking in the lobby on one occasion. She reported each incident to local authorities, but they seemed reluctant to get involved. Toth speculated that some old intelligence figure, or a small ring of men with ties to the KGB-era networks, might be behind the harassment. Perhaps they feared that shining a light on Thomas's story would implicate them in the assassination attempt or subsequent cover-ups. The official line in old intelligence circles was that the Hungarian defector was the shooter, and the Soviets were victims. If Thomas's testimony revealed otherwise, it could undermine official accounts, even decades later. Despite the tension, Grace refused to give in. Her determination only grew. She began sorting through more archives with Toth, seeking any sign of the involvement of that sympathetic border officer Thomas had alluded to in the letter. She found mention of a mid-ranking official who had later been imprisoned for helping illegal crossings, but the details were murky. Every new piece of information hinted at the courage and desperation behind Thomas's flight. At last, feeling she had gone as far as she could in Budapest for the time being, Grace made plans to return home. She bid a warm farewell to Toth, thanking him profusely for his assistance. The day before her flight, Miklos came to her hotel lobby, carrying a small black and white photo of his parents from their wedding day. He offered it to her, saying it might help remind her of the life Thomas had once lived. She accepted it with tearful gratitude, promising to keep it safe. The flight back to New York felt strangely unreal. She had come to Budapest seeking answers and found more than she ever imagined. Yet she also brought home new questions, along with a bond to a man who was, biologically, her stepson. She wondered how they would navigate that relationship. Was there a term for the widow of a father you never knew? Arriving home, she found her house as she had left it, quiet, filled with memories of Peter. The only difference was that her perspective had irrevocably changed. She found herself glancing at photographs of him with renewed scrutiny. She recognized that gentle smile and realized it might have masked decades of guilt. She felt no resentment now, only a profound sadness that he had borne that burden alone. She began tidying the house in preparation for Miklós's visit. He planned to come in early summer, once his university duties ended. She fretted over small details, unsure how to host a man who was essentially the living legacy of her husband's secret. In the meantime, she visited old friends and cautiously confided in one or two who she trusted most. Their reactions varied from shock to bewilderment. They never suspected anything about Peter. No one had. He had integrated seamlessly into American life, forging the identity of Peter Mitchell so completely that even those who'd known him for decades had no inkling of a Hungarian origin. In early June, Miklós arrived. Grace met him at the airport, feeling a jolt of nervous anticipation. He emerged from the customs area, looking tense, a single suitcase in hand. She waved, and he spotted her, offering a tentative smile. They exchanged a brief, awkward hug. She sensed that both of them were stepping into uncharted territory. The drive from the airport to her suburban home was filled with careful conversation. Miklós peered out the car window, absorbing the wide highways, the rows of houses, the American flags fluttering on porches. He seemed curious, though also guarded. Grace pointed out landmarks, shopping centers, local schools, unsure what might interest him. Mostly, he listened in silence. At her house, she showed him the guest room and let him settle in. She prepared a simple dinner, mindful that she didn't know his dietary preferences. He ate politely, glancing around at the decor, the framed pictures on the wall, snapshots of her and Peter at various ages. She noticed his gaze linger on an old wedding photo from 1976. Peter looked impossibly young, but that was years after he'd fled Hungary. She wondered what Miklós saw in that image. Maybe the father he never got to know. In the following days, she took him to the local spots that had shaped her life with Peter. They walked through the park where Peter used to jog on Saturday mornings, visited the diner where he loved the pie. She showed him the library where she once worked. Miklós listened quietly, occasionally asking pointed questions. Did he ever mention nightmares? Did he seem anxious in large crowds? She realized Miklós was searching for signs that Peter carried the trauma of flight and fear. She admitted that sometimes, Peter would wake from disturbing dreams, or jump at sudden noises. He always brushed it off, claiming he had a restless mind. Now she understood those reactions were likely shadows from his past. They spent hours in the living room, sifting through photographs and letters, many of them new to Miklós. She showed him the handful of postcards from places she and Peter had visited: Niagara Falls, Washington, D.C. She explained which of their friends were from Peter's job in insurance sales, which neighbors they were close to. Miklós listened, occasionally jotting notes in a small notebook. She wondered if he was dissecting each detail, trying to reconcile this American father with the Hungarian one he never had. At one point, Grace led him to the attic, opening the trunks containing old keepsakes. She showed him the battered suitcase where she'd discovered the false compartment. They examined the hidden panel. Miklós ran his hand over it with a strange mix of reverence and sorrow. He hid this part of himself so well, he murmured. He must have lived in constant fear. They found some of Peter's personal items, including a pocket dictionary of Hungarian to English, well-worn, with scribbled notes in the margins. Miklós flipped through it, eyes stinging with tears. He was teaching himself English while he was here, maybe, Grace said quietly. She recalled how Peter had arrived in the U.S. with a slight accent that he claimed was from growing up around different places, though it was never pronounced enough for anyone to question it. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Miklós asked to see Peter's grave. Grace explained that Peter was cremated, his ashes interred in a small mausoleum at the local cemetery. Miklós grew thoughtful, then expressed a desire to visit anyway. So they went, driving out to the peaceful grounds where a line of niches held urns. Grace led Miklós to the simple bronze plaque engraved with Peter Mitchell, 1945 to 2010. The dates he had given as birth and death. Miklos knelt, pressing a hand to the plaque, tears slipping down his cheeks. He whispered something in Hungarian. Grace bowed her head, feeling the weight of the moment. When he stood, he faced her with red-rimmed eyes. "I'm angry," he said, voice trembling. "And yet, I also miss him even though I never knew him. It's all so unfair." Grace reached out, setting a gentle hand on his arm. "I understand," she whispered, her own eyes misting. She recalled how her anger had eventually given way to empathy. Maybe Miklos needed time for that same transition. Over the next weeks, Miklos and Grace formed a delicate rhythm. Some days, he explored the town on his own, venturing into libraries or local archives to see if there was any official trace of Peter Mitchell's early years. Of course, there wasn't. That identity only began in 1973. Other days, they would share meals, quietly swapping stories about the man they both had known in utterly different ways. Sometimes, the conversation grew tense. Miklos would ask pointedly why Peter never attempted to contact them once it was safe, while Grace would struggle to defend a decision she herself didn't fully understand. Yet in those struggles, they found honesty. They were forging a connection that spanned the rift between Thomas's two lives. One afternoon, Miklos shared something he had brought from Hungary, an old book of poetry by Attila Joseph, a cherished volume belonging to Clara. He set it on Grace's kitchen table, explaining that his mother had read these poems aloud in their small apartment when he was little. When she died, he kept the book as a memento of her gentle spirit. Now he wanted Grace to see a piece of the culture and the love Thomas had left behind. She leafed through the pages, not understanding the Hungarian words, but feeling the weight of sorrow in them. Miklos found a short poem describing longing for a home that no longer exists. He translated it roughly into English. Grace's eyes brimmed with tears as she listened. She pictured Thomas, exiled in a new country, carrying that same longing. As Miklos prepared to return to Budapest, Grace found herself wishing he could stay longer. The sense of unresolved sadness lingered, but they both agreed this time together had been meaningful. On his final evening, they took a walk by the river that cut through town, the setting sun casting an amber glow. Miklos confessed that, for all his anger, he felt a strange comfort in the knowledge that his father hadn't simply abandoned them out of selfishness. "He was running for his life," he murmured. "Still, it doesn't erase the pain, but I suppose it helps me understand." Grace nodded, tears touching her cheeks. She told him how Peter, for all his secrecy, had been a loving partner, devoted in every ordinary way. "I think he never stopped loving you and your mother," she said quietly. Miklos swallowed hard, gazing at the water. They walked on in silence, letting the hush of dusk envelope them. In the morning, she drove him back to the airport. At the security checkpoint, they embraced, both uncertain about how to phrase their farewell. "Thank you," Miklos said softly, "for telling me the truth." Grace nodded, her throat tight. She watched him pass through the gate, a piece of Peter's past and future both. Life returned to a quieter routine after he left. Grace felt a sense of closure blooming within her, though it was not the neat, storybook kind. Instead, it was tinged with sorrow and acceptance. She believed that the circle, if not fully mended, was at least acknowledged. Over the following months, she and Miklos corresponded via email. She even tried to learn a bit of Hungarian so she could read a few lines from the poetry book he had shared. He continued to research the details of Thomas's flight, even tracing the identity of the American whose papers Thomas might have used. An actual Peter Mitchell who died under tragic circumstances in Greece, leaving an identity that Thomas could adopt. Occasionally, Grace still received vague warnings or threatening notes, as if someone out there didn't want old truths exposed. She passed these on to local authorities but tried not to dwell on them. Whoever wanted the past buried had likely realized she knew enough to share it, but she refused to be intimidated. Thomas's secrets had cost him a life with his first family. She would not let them erase his memory. One day, the phone rang, and she heard Miklos's voice. He was speaking from Budapest, his tone calmer than ever. He said he had visited Clara's grave for the first time in years, placing fresh flowers and telling her what he had learned. That Thomas had been alive, forced into exile, but that he had found a new family in America. I forgave him, in a way, by telling her the truth, he confessed, voice breaking. Grace felt tears flood her eyes. She pictured mother and son reunited in spirit, if not in life, with the knowledge that Thomas's flight hadn't been simple desertion. Summer eased into autumn, and Grace decided to frame 2 photos side by side in her living room. The faded one showing Thomas, Clara, and the baby Miklos, and the more recent one of her with Peter in Central Park during their first year of marriage. She gazed at them often, seeing them as the 2 halves of one complicated man's life. She no longer felt a sharp pang of betrayal. Instead, she felt a profound respect for the courage it must have taken for him to escape certain death and, at the same time, a deep sadness for the love and time lost. She whispered silent words to him sometimes, standing before those photos. "You did what you had to do. I wish you could have told me." Toth, the historian, eventually contacted her with an update. Official Soviet records, many of which were destroyed or locked away, suggested that the KGB operative behind the Vienna shooting had indeed been active for years after 1972. The Hungarian state had pinned the blame on a scapegoat. Thomas's eyewitness account, if made public, could have unraveled a web of lies. Toth concluded that it was no wonder Thomas fled without a trace. Even if, decades later, the danger lessened, perhaps the mental scars never did. Grace closed her eyes upon hearing that, imagining Peter feeling that old terror every time the phone rang at odd hours or whenever a stranger showed up in their neighborhood. As the leaves turned gold and red, Grace felt she had done all she could to piece together the missing chapters of Peter's life. She found a measure of serenity in embracing every facet of who he had been. The devoted husband she knew and the desperate Hungarian fugitive forging a new identity. She told Miklos she planned to visit Budapest again in the spring, not for more investigation, but simply to spend time with him and learn more about his mother's life. He seemed grateful, responding that she was welcome anytime. In the quiet of her home, she occasionally reread the letter Thomas had written to Clara, the lines of Hungarian scrawled in a trembling hand. Though she couldn't understand all the words, she remembered Magda's translation. Apologies for the heartbreak, pleas for forgiveness, confessions of undying love for Clara and little Miklos. Every time she read it, her heart twitched with empathy. She believed Thomas would have wanted his wife and son to know he never stopped caring, just as she believed he loved her too. Did that make him disloyal or only human, forced to navigate an impossible choice? Life pressed on. Grace resumed some volunteer work at the local library, found solace in small, everyday routines, tending to her garden, sharing dinner with close friends, enjoying the hush of early morning coffee by the window. The storms of fear and betrayal had eased, replaced by a deeper understanding of her husband's quiet sadness. Sometimes old friends would ask how she was coping with widowhood, and she would say she was doing better, that she was discovering new things about Peter that brought her closer to him even in his absence. She rarely gave details, but she spoke with a kind of reverence. Winter arrived, blanketing her neighborhood in white. On a cold afternoon, she drove to the cemetery and stood by Peter's memorial plaque, where a dusting of snow gathered on the bronze edges. She stood there for a long time, remembering his gentle smile. She told him, softly, that she had found his son, that she understood at last why he had said so little about his past. Tears froze on her cheeks as she assured him that Miklos was a good man, shaped by heartbreak but moving toward healing. She left a small sprig of pine and walked away, feeling the crisp air fill her lungs with something akin to release. Over the next few months, Grace and Miklos wrote to each other in more detail, sometimes even video chatting, bridging the distance of an ocean. He shared old photographs of Clara, telling stories of her warmth and resilience. Grace offered anecdotes about her life with Peter, the time they got lost on a country road late at night, the private jokes they shared over morning coffee. In these stories, they found a mutual space where they could honor the man who connected them without negating their own experiences. Miklos's resentment, while not entirely gone, softened into a nuanced acceptance. Grace felt her heart lighten with every exchange. Spring brought a renewal of color to Grace's garden, and also the arrival of an unexpected letter from an archive in Austria. It contained partial records referencing the name Thomas Varga, though most details were redacted. The letter concluded with a cryptic note that certain documents remained classified. Grace felt a pang of frustration. So many hidden layers still. She shrugged it off. She had enough truth to live in peace, and no desire to chase official secrets any further. If shadows remained, so be it. One day, as she sat on her porch sipping tea, Grace realized how deeply she had changed. A year ago, she had been consumed by shock and betrayal, her life upended. Now, she felt a calm acceptance, a recognition that people are complex, shaped by circumstances often beyond their control. She felt grateful for the decades she shared with Peter Mitchell, whose gentle heart and quiet smile had brightened her life. She also felt grateful to have met Miklos, to see in him the living testament to Thomas's first family. The lines of identity were blurred, but she believed love could cross those divides. She took out the framed photos from her living room wall. Carefully, she cleaned the glass, then repositioned them so that Thomas and Clara with baby Miklos on the left, and Peter with Grace on the right, looked balanced. She saw in those side-by-side images a continuum of one life, split by tragedy but reunited in memory. She whispered words she wished she could have told Peter. "I understand now. You were braver than I ever realized." Eventually, she penned a letter to Miklos, inviting him to join her in scattering a small portion of Peter's ashes in a place meaningful to all of them. She had kept some aside before the urn was placed in the mausoleum. She suggested that they scatter them in the Danube, the river that coursed through Budapest, or perhaps in the city where Peter had begun anew. It was a symbolic gesture, a way of honoring both Thomas and Peter. Miklos wrote back that he would think it over. Whether or not they carried it out didn't matter as much as the shared sentiment behind it. Summer arrived in a blaze of warmth, and Grace found herself flipping through travel brochures for Budapest, pondering another trip to meet Miklos. She no longer feared the potential threats of strangers slipping notes under her door. She trusted that the story had lost its potency after so many decades. And if there were still those who wanted it buried, they had already made their point. She considered whether it might be healing for Miklos to see pictures of the place where Peter spent his last breath. She wondered if the house that once felt so empty would now hold a sense of extended family if Miklos stood in the living room again. Sometimes, she found herself speaking to Peter in her mind, telling him about these developments. She pictured him listening quietly, that faint smile he always gave when she rambled about her day. She imagined him nodding, perhaps even thanking her for bridging the chasm he never could. She felt a steady warmth in those moments, as though he truly heard her. As the year moved forward, she came to believe that closure wasn't a single event but a series of small reckonings, each one stitching a wound that might never fully vanish but could at least heal over. She saw how Miklos's life continued in Budapest, teaching literature, writing academic articles. He occasionally referenced the father he never knew in his lectures, discussing how personal trauma can shape an author's voice. Grace suspected that, in some unspoken way, Thomas's story had become a source of introspection for Miklos, fueling his academic pursuit of narratives shaped by political conflict and exile. In turn, she gave a short speech at her local library's community event, referencing how easily entire stories can be erased or rewritten by history. She didn't name Peter or Thomas, but she spoke with quiet conviction about the need to remember. She concluded by saying that sometimes, we only truly see the people we love when we accept the secrets they carry. One bright afternoon, she found herself dusting the mantel, where she had placed the framed photos and a small Hungarian flag Miklos had given her. She realized that, for all her heartbreak, she felt richer for knowing the truth. She felt she had reclaimed the full measure of the man she loved, not just the parts he showed her. She whispered softly, "You deserve to be known, Thomas. Thank you for sharing your life with me." She gazed at those photos, imagining Clara's gentle smile, the baby Miklos in Thomas's arms, the hardships they endured. Then she looked at her own wedding photo with Peter, remembering the kindness he had shown her every day, how he had guided her through life's ups and downs. Different worlds, different stories, fused in one man. She smiled, a touch wistful, a touch grateful. Thank you for following this journey. If you found it meaningful, like and subscribe for more.